CrossCode is a fantastic game. I think the combat system is its most compelling aspect. On a basic level, you can throw, melee attack, dodge and block. Attacks fill up a bar you can spend on special attacks. The fine details of these core mechanics make this combat system so great. When you are aiming, you have a cone showing your accuracy that gradually tightens. When it is fully accurate, it's called a charge shot, which has more damage, knocks the enemy back, and can stun enemies inside vulnerable states. So you have a choice to throw out multiple inaccurate balls for more DPS, or one charge shot. But charging means you are immobile for some time, which is dangerous. So there is some commitment to a charge shot. Both ways of using your ranged attack have advantages and drawbacks. You will need to use both for different situations. The melee attack chain has 3 quick attacks, followed by a spin that has high damage and hits all around you. But that final hit also has very long recovery, which can be pretty deadly. So you can learn to dash cancel the attack chain before the final hit, to achieve a more steady damage output and always be ready to respond to an enemy. You can dash up to 3 times in quick succession. Anything more and you'll cover no distance at all. That's not good. After your third dash, you need some time to recover. But you can also pull up your shield for just a tiny moment to recover your dashes. So 3 dashes, quick block and keep going, which is the fastest way to move around the game world, and it's very useful to avoid enemy attacks. Blocking will reduce the damage you take and give you some knockback resistance. If you time the block to guard the attack at the last possible moment, then you'll do a perfect guard and take 0 damage. On certain melee attacks, this will also count as a parry and leave the enemy vulnerable. The combat is pretty deep. There's always something you can improve at. As you progress through the game, you also unlock 4 different elements. Each of them has their own skill tree with passives and special attacks to unlock. It's very impressive to me how many attacks they were able to design that fulfill completely different functions in combat. Shooting an icicle, which goes through enemies and then splits into homing ice shards. This attack is excellent for enemies that have a frontal shield, because you can hit them from the back. A fire melee attack that draws enemies in to deal with a group. Dashing away and leaving a clone to take the enemy's aggro away from you for a second. A bouncing lightning ball that chains enemies together and staggers them with lightning strikes. There's so much to experiment with, and over time you'll figure out your favorite moveset. The skill trees present you with a choice of 2 attacks, but those branches on the tree can be swapped around at any time to play with the other attack. And the main quest will give you items to fully respec a skill tree. So the game encourages experimentation. I love the elements in CrossCode. My favorite one would have to be cold. The melee attack keeps you stationary while charging up a big attack, which deals so much damage that I was able to sometimes skip an entire phase of a boss. Each element also has a status effect you can inflict on the enemy. And chilled enemies have all the animations slowed down, which is the best effect in my opinion, because you get longer openings to attack and their attacks are easier to avoid. All of these combat mechanics lead to really fun gameplay, because they are paired up with some great enemy design. To kill an enemy effectively, you want to break them, which keeps them completely stunned and lowers their defenses. And it's up to you to figure out how to break the enemy or boss. Some require melee attacks in a vulnerable state, or hitting a specific body part. Others need a charged shot or a perfect guard on one of their attacks. The enemies also have elemental weaknesses. The values are typically around 50% less or more damage. So learning when to use what element is very much worth it. CrossCode combat has a nice mix of action RPG elements, like reading enemy attack patterns, timing your dodges, attacking in openings while not getting greedy. But it's also very much a puzzle game, where an enemy has some gimmick and you beat them by learning the solution. Both sides are very fun. I think that's amazing. At this point, I should probably tell you what CrossCode is even about. We are playing an MMO called Cross Worlds. Each player you meet is a human hooked up to the game with something like a virtual reality headset. It's a video game inside a video game. Our character, Leah, wakes up inside Cross Worlds but has no memory of her life outside of the game. And that's the main hook of the story. You'll remember more and more pieces of your past as you're progressing through the game. It's interesting how you have 2 storylines advancing at the same time. The story of the MMO, which has you follow the footsteps of an ancient race to uncover a secret left by the gods. and the more meta storyline, which explores the company developing the game, and also what's going on with Leah. The tone of the story is mostly light, but CrossCode can also get a bit heavy in some chapters. In my opinion, the plot is not the strongest aspect of CrossCode. It's decent, and the characters are nice. I was more into the world building, and the MMO feeling they were able to create with lots of small details. There are players discussing old versions of the game, or waiting for a particular update. Your friend Emily complains about a quest being instanced, so you can't play together. You'll see reoccurring players that are completing the game at the same time as you, like the girl getting dizzy from heights in-game. Player groups are frequent around a zone's fast travel point, but become rarer the further out you are. You have people that are fully immersed into the lore, and others just care about the gameplay. It's clear to me that the devs played a lot of MMOs. They managed to give CrossCode a very cozy feeling, in large part due to Emily, her opening up about stuff going on in her life, excitedly making plans to complete the content together, and her competitive nature with the dungeon races she likes to do. Best character in the game by far. Next up, the exploration. The world is made up of different zones. There is some great variety. A jungle, an autumn forest, a snowy mountain. Each zone has a town and a big dungeon for you to find. You can do side quests along the way, fight the enemies, and solve puzzles to open chests. The game has a ton of platforming challenges, where you have to find the correct path to a chest. And it sometimes starts several rooms away, which is overall very fun. It forces you to really observe an area. But it's also here where I have my biggest criticism of CrossCode. Sometimes it's very difficult to recognize whether a part of the map is at a different elevation level. You will try jumping onto it, but it was higher up. To be fair, showcasing elevation in a 2D game is not easy. To an extent, it's always interpretation, because you are missing that third axis of a 3D game. If I show you this image, for example, you could make the assumption that the ball is flying straight at Leah. But in reality, I shot it from a higher elevation, and it flies above her. One way to get around this issue in CrossCode is to aim a shot and use the aim point like a rangefinder. If your ball bounces off the object, then it's higher up. If the ball passes over it, then it's at your elevation or below. When in doubt, you can always whip out this trick. So it's not that bad. As you explore the map and fight enemies, you get a combat ranking, which simply measures how many enemies you defeated in a row without leaving combat for too long. Outside of combat, you heal up pretty much instantly, but in combat you need to use consumables to heal, which then also gives you a cooldown. It's a simple risk-reward system. Higher combat ranks increase the drop rate of materials, so you want to see how far you can push it for loot. But if you die, then you're set back to the start of the room you died in. I like this mechanic. How it goes is that you do a first run through a map to find all the hidden secrets. And then afterwards, you do a big long combo to get lots of materials for crafting new gear. The equipment in CrossCode adds some very nice flavor to the combat. They increase your basic stats like damage, health and defense, but they also come with special modifiers which are far more impactful. Your melee attacks send out additional projectiles, gaining knockback resistance to small attacks. Having faster movement while charging a shot, reflecting damage when an enemy hits your shield, increasing the window to execute a perfect guard, or some passive healing inside of combat. The gear allows you to specialize into the specific aspect you enjoy most of the combat. Melee, ranged, dodging, tanking, or you can mix and go for any hybrid setup. I really enjoyed theory crafting a build, and then getting the gear for it. CrossCode has a tiny bit of Monster Hunter DNA. You go into a new town, look at the equipment you want, and then set a goal to acquire the materials in that area, which makes the exploration, questing and combat even more fun, because you know what you're trying to get out from it. One small complaint is that you can't pin or wishlist the crafting recipes for equipment. Keeping all the materials you need in mind and which trader is offering the gear can get a bit much. There is a book that keeps track of all trading offers, but that becomes quite full near the end of the game. Each area of the game ends with a big dungeon. They are really fun, but the game is also very different when you're in a dungeon. Exploring an area, doing quests, and CrossCode is an action RPG. Inside the dungeon, it's a straight up puzzle game, with not that much combat. I think that's important to know. And if you don't like puzzles that much, then you'd probably find those parts tedious. I wish the dungeons leaned a bit more into combat. The rooms which use dungeon puzzles to defeat enemies are fantastic. They are just pretty rare. You will often get 10 rooms back to back of just straight problem solving. But I like puzzles. And I think the ones in CrossCode are very high quality. The dungeons are themed around the elements. And the puzzles incorporate the new element you are about to receive from the dungeon. Figuring out how this element reacts to objects in the environment and putting this knowledge to the test with increasingly difficult rooms. I was never bored by it. The game also has 2 distinct types of puzzles. There are the more typical ones which test your understanding. And once you figured out the solution, executing it is only a matter of seconds. And then there are the timed puzzles, where it's easy to understand what the game asks of you, but it's testing your ability to think fast. You send out a ball and have to keep it going by activating mechanisms around the room. These puzzles can get pretty challenging. There's a room near the end of the game that is arguably the real final boss fight of CrossCode. But the game also has very customizable difficulty settings. You can tone down enemy damage, their attack frequency, and also the speed for these puzzles, if you want. Besides the main quest, CrossCode also has a ton of very good side content. But that's not really true at the start of the game. There are a bunch of fetch quests, which makes sense given the MMO setting. In my opinion, they don't really add any tedium to the game though. Kill this enemy 10 times, gather 20 of this material. Stuff you would be doing anyways when exploring the world. It's the type of quest you accept and then sometime later get a pop-up that you have everything the NPC requested. I'm very neutral on these quests. They don't bother me, but are also not interesting. However, the side quests of the mid and late game are really good. There are mini dungeons you can only access through a quest. Boss fights with unique mechanics. The game even shifts genres for some quests. For one, you're extracting crates from a rooftop while avoiding enemy fire. Another quest is a tower defense mode with increasingly harder waves. The variety of content is incredible. It keeps the game feeling very fresh. I did pretty much every quest in the game and finished the base game of CrossCode with 54 hours of playtime. Pretty late into the game, you unlock the arena, which is great fun. You get a score based on how quickly you finish a round, how little damage you took, and extra conditions like beating it without healing or killing multiple enemies in a short amount of time. You can spend a ton of time here trying to perfect your gameplay. And it's also a great way to refight bosses. I always love it when a game gives you that option. The game even has a pretty cool New Game Plus system. There are a ton of options to toggle. Keep your gear and stats or start a fresh character. Let the enemy levels scale with your own or keep the normal static levels. You can modify XP gain, enemy damage, enemy aggression. There are even some fun challenge runs baked into the system, like one-hit death or restricting yourself to only 1 dash instead of 3. The replay value of CrossCode is very high. I would also recommend the DLC for CrossCode, A New Home. It ties up some loose ends of the story, gives you another very good area to explore, has a bunch of side quests, expands the arena, and it has the largest dungeon by far. All of it took me 13 hours and was just as good as the base game. The DLC is great if you want to get the most out of the game, especially the combat. I don't want to spoil the final boss, but it is kinda crazy and demands a very high level of mastery. It is also my favorite fight in CrossCode. However, there is no rush to get the DLC. It continues right where the base game leaves off, so you should just play the game and see if you feel like playing more by the end. That was a lot of praise. Do I have any major complaints about the game? Not really. CrossCode is not my favorite game of all time, but I can't think of many games that are so well-rounded and consistent. Combat and exploration are fun. Puzzles are engaging. Story is interesting. There is no chapter in the game which I would pick out as the bad part. There is no boss fight I disliked. I highly recommend CrossCode. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to see future content. Until then, goodbye.